Around 190,000 years ago, someone died in a cave on the slopes of Mount Carmel on the coast of what is now Israel. Almost nothing of them survived. Just a fragment of upper jaw, still holding most of its teeth, buried under layers of ash from fires that had been lit and relit in that cave for thousands of years. When researchers finally dated it, the number came back so early it broke the timeline of human migration. But here's the part that makes this strange. That person was almost certainly not your ancestor. Neither were the people buried 100,000 years later in the caves, a short walk away, laid in the ground with red ochre and pierced shells. The first humans to walk out of Africa left behind bones, tools, hearths, and graves. What they did not leave behind was us. They got out, they lived, and then they vanished. This is the story of the migrations that failed, and why the one that finally worked had almost nothing to do with bravery. For most of the last century, the story of how we spread across the planet was simple enough to fit on a single page of a textbook. Our species appeared in Africa. Somewhere around 60,000 years ago, a group crossed into the Middle East, and from there their descendants fanned out across Asia, Europe, Australia, and eventually the Americas. One exodus, one founding population. A single doorway, opened once. It was a clean story, and for a long time the genetics seemed to back it up. Because when you sample living people from anywhere outside Africa, they all trace back to a surprisingly small, ancestral group. The problem was the ground kept producing bones that did not fit. The Mount Carmel jaw came out of a site called Mislia Cave, excavated by a team led by Israel Hershkovitz of Tel Aviv University and Mina Weinstein Evron of the University of Haifa. The fossil, along with its teeth, was dated to between 177,000 and 194,000 years ago, making it the oldest member of the Homo sapiens clade found outside Africa. It came from sediments packed with well-defined hearths, a rich stone tool industry, and abundant animal remains. Bjorksiv, Bjorksiv. That is not the signature of a lost expedition wandering into unfamiliar country. That is people living somewhere. Hershkovitz put the implication bluntly, arguing that if the Mislia fossil really dates that early, the entire narrative of our species has to be pushed back substantially, because if modern humans were traveling out of Africa 200,000 years ago, they must have originated in Africa considerably earlier than that. Niche and Mislia was not alone. It was just the oldest. A short distance from Mount Carmel sit two of the most famous caves in the study of human origins. Skul and Kafza, first excavated in the 1930s by the British archaeologist Dorothy Garrod and her colleagues. The bones from those caves belong to people who look thoroughly, recognizably modern. They date to somewhere around 90,000 to 120,000 years ago. John Hawkes. What makes Skul and Kafze remarkable is not just their age, it's what these people were doing. They buried their dead deliberately. One young woman at Kafze was laid in a pit with the antlers of a deer placed across her chest. There were shells at these sites, some of them pierced and carried in from the Mediterranean coast, some stained with pigment. There was red ochre, ground and used. These are the small, useless, enormously important behaviors that tell you a group of people had symbols and ritual and probably stories. So the picture that emerges is not of a few travelers stumbling into the Levant. It's of communities. People with a culture living in a landscape they knew well for thousands of years. And then the layers change. Above the levels holding those modern human burials, in caves across the same region, you find Neanderthals. The people from Skul and Kafsa do not continue upward through the sediment. They stop. The region carries on without them. Something happened to them. And to understand what, we have to go somewhere much stranger. In 1978, in a cave called Apidema on the rocky coast of the Mani Peninsula in southern Greece, Workers pulled two fossilized skulls out of the cliff face. Both were badly damaged. One had been crushed and distorted so severely during fossilization it was almost unreadable. They sat in a collection for decades, awkward and unclassified. Then a team led by Katarina Harvati at the University of Tübingen reconstructed them digitally and dated them using uranium series methods. The better preserved skull, Apidema II, came back at more than 170,000 years old, with a clearly Neanderthal pattern. The fragmentary one, Apidema I, came back at more than 210,000 years old and showed a mixture of modern human features and older, more primitive ones. If that reading is correct, a population related to us was standing on a Greek shoreline more than 200,000 years ago and was later replaced there by Neanderthals. I should be careful here because this is one of the genuinely contested finds in the field. Apidema I is a partial skull, missing the face, and other researchers have argued the anatomy points to something other than our species. The debate is live, and it has not been settled. But it fits a pattern that has become harder and harder to dismiss, because the next site is not ambiguous at all. Picture the Arabian Peninsula. Today the Nefud is sand and heat and almost nothing. 85,000 years ago it was a different world entirely. Rainfall patterns shifted, monsoons pushed north, and the peninsula turned green. Grassland. Hundreds of freshwater lakes, herds of grazing animals, and hippos in the water, which tells you just how much water there was. At a site called Al-Wusta, sitting on the shore of one of those ancient lakes, a team including Hugh Graucut and Michael Petraglia found a single human finger bone in 2016 surrounded by hundreds of stone tools and animal fossils. Al-Wusta I is the oldest directly dated fossil of our species outside Africa and the Levant, placing Homo sapiens in the Arabian Peninsula before 85,000 years ago. The find directly challenged the idea that modern humans stayed put until 60,000 years ago, so now we have at least three separate windows. A jaw in Israel near 200,000 years old. Burials in the same region around 100,000. A finger bone in Arabia at 85,000. Different times, different routes, different landscapes. And here's where the story turns. Because we can now check something the archaeologists of the 1930s never could. We can ask the descendants. Except there aren't any. Over the last 15 years, geneticists have been reading DNA out of ancient bones, and the picture that has come back is unforgiving. In late 2024, two studies published in Nature and Science tackled the question directly by examining the Neanderthal DNA carried by people alive today, along with genomes from ancient individuals. Every person outside Africa carries a small percentage of Neanderthal ancestry. The obvious assumption would be that this DNA arrived in many separate encounters, spread over 100,000 years of contact. That's not what the data shows. Analysis of roughly 45,000-year-old remains from Ranis in Germany, together with the Zlatý individual from Czechia, found that the Neanderthal segments in their genomes come from a single admixture event shared with all non-Africans, dated to roughly 45,000 to 49,000 years ago. A parallel study of 300 genomes from the Max Planck Institute in Leipzig and the University of California, Berkeley, put that event at about 47,000 years ago, implying a migration out of Africa no later than 43,500 years ago. University of Cambridge, Schemex 1 event, one shared population, every living person whose ancestry lies outside sub-Saharan Africa traces back through that single narrow window, which means the people at Mislia, at school, at Kafse, at Al-Wusta are not upstream of anyone alive. They are branches that ended. The 2024 work makes this point in an almost eerie way because the finding implies that modern human remains older than 50,000 years from outside Africa represent different, non-African populations altogether. Separate attempts, separate stories, separate endings. University of Cambridge. And it gets stranger because even some of the migrants who arrived during the successful window did not make it. The genomes from Ranis show a small, isolated group that had recently mixed with Neanderthals and left no present-day descendants at all. Simex people were in Europe. They had families. They made tools that archaeologists still argue about. And the line simply stops. So the obvious question, the one that has bothered researchers for decades, is why? Why did people who buried their dead with ochre and antlers, who lit fires in the same cave for generations, who crossed into Arabia and lived beside lakes full of hippos, why did all of them fail, and then one group succeed so completely that their descendants ended up on every continent on Earth? The easy answer would be a sudden leap, a new tool, a new weapon, a mutation that flipped some cognitive switch. That answer has been proposed many times, and the evidence for it has always been thin. In June 2025, a study published in Nature offered something less dramatic and, I think, far more interesting. The team, co-led by Emily Hallett of Loyola University Chicago and Michela Leonardi of the Natural History Museum in London, with Eleanor Sherry of the Max Planck Institute of Geoanthropology and Andrea Manica of the University of Cambridge, took a different approach. They assembled a data set of archaeological sites and environmental information spanning the last 120,000 years in Africa, then used methods borrowed from ecology to track the human niche, meaning the range of habitats people could actually thrive in. What they found was a shift. Starting around 70,000 years ago, the human niche began to expand sharply, most noticeably in West, Central, and North Africa, driven by people moving into far more varied habitat types, including dense forest and arid desert. Springer. As Sherry described it, from about 70,000 years ago, people suddenly intensify their use of diverse habitats and push into new ones in a way not seen before, exploiting more kinds of woodland, closed canopy forest, desert, highland, and grassland. She points to a possible trigger, noting that an ice age was approaching, which meant drier conditions across parts of Africa, and that humans may have responded to that squeeze by learning to survive in habitats they had previously ignored. Sit with what that means. The skill that let us take the planet was not developed on the way out. It was developed at home, under pressure, in Africa, over roughly 20,000 years of being forced into ground nobody wanted. And it explains the failures beautifully. The earlier dispersals, the ones that left no lasting descendants, seem to have happened during unusually favorable windows of increased rainfall across the Saharo-Arabian desert belt, which opened green corridors people could simply walk through. That's the trap. Those groups were not conquering hostile territory, they were following the grass. And grass, on that timescale, is temporary. When the rains failed and the corridor closed behind them, they were specialists stranded in a landscape that had stopped being the landscape they knew. Small populations isolated with nowhere to retreat to. It doesn't take a catastrophe to end a lineage under those conditions. It just takes a few bad centuries. The later expansion faced worse conditions. Around 70 to 50,000 years ago, the easiest route out of Africa was harder going than it had been in earlier periods, and yet that dispersal was large, and it was the one that stuck. Sherry sums the whole thing up in one line worth remembering. Our superpower, she says, is that we are ecosystem generalists. Springer. Not the strongest, not the smartest, in any way we can measure from bones, just the hardest to eliminate because there was no single habitat we depended on. There is one last thing, and it's the detail I keep coming back to. Those failed migrations may not have vanished as completely as the family trees suggest. When geneticists sequence Neanderthal genomes, they find traces of gene flow running the other way, from a population related to early modern humans into Neanderthals, well over 100,000 years before the encounter that gave us our Neanderthal DNA. Which means that when those early travelers reached the Levant and met the people already living there, something happened. Not conquest, not replacement, contact. So the first humans to leave Africa did leave a mark. It just isn't in us. It's in the genomes of a species that is also gone, recovered from bones in caves in Siberia and Croatia. A signal from a meeting nobody recorded and nobody survived to describe. We tend to tell the story of leaving Africa as a triumph. One journey, one direction, forward and outward and upward. The evidence describes something more human than that. A species pressing against the same door over and over across 200,000 years, getting through, settling in, and then losing the thread, again, and again, and again. Until one group, hardened by a drying continent into people who could live almost anywhere, walked out through a harder route than any of the ones before, and simply did not stop. If you want to know what happened to the people who were already living out there when we arrived, and how their last populations held on far longer than anyone expected, that story is on screen now.